All right, boom. We are live on the YouTubes, everybody here. Stallman Smith Jr. for the Unapologetic Apologist. Very excited for today's episode. My guest has been on the show a couple times before, but this time I get to introduce him as Dr. Tim Stratton. He's got his PhD. Dr. Tim Stratton, how you doing, brother?
I'm doing good, Stallman. Thanks for having me on the show again.
Absolutely, absolutely. And one thing I want to say to the audience, because a question you get asked when you're kind of in this realm and people talk to you and they learn about apologetics is, who's your favorite apologist? And some people can go with past guys like Aquinas or Anselm, those guys. Some guys go with more modern answers like William and Craig. My answer to everybody is always Dr. Tim Stratton. You're my favorite apologist, brother.
Wow.
So yeah, very excited to have you on because we are responding to a video Capturing Christianity hosted a debate. Our mutual friend Cameron Bertuzzi, two guys, does God's foreknowledge preclude human freedom? And who else better to have on than Tim Stratton to evaluate that stuff? So, but before we get into the video, I did want to ask you, just so people are aware, looking out for, we don't know the release date yet, but tell everybody the name of your book real quick.
Yeah, it's a book published by Whippenstock. It'll be out soon. It's called Human Freedom, Divine Knowledge, and Mere Molinism.
Awesome, yeah. And then we will get you back on the show once you release that. I'm going to do a video promoting it as soon as I'm able to read it, because one of the good things about having a show like this is you get to extort your friends for free merchandise like their books. So, I'm just being serious.
Yeah. I get you a copy.
But I guess before taking too much time, we will get right into it. And just to let everybody know, Tim Stratton's channel, Free Thinking Ministries, is in the description. So definitely go click on that, subscribe to his channel. And after this episode, we're going to do a web extended exclusive for subscribers at subscribestar.com/TUA. You can sign up there. You get all the bonus content. We'll be getting into more political issues because this channel is focused towards apologetics, not really political stuff. But so if you want to see that discussion, you go subscribe there. And also, if you subscribe at any tier now, you'll enter the next book giveaway I'm doing. So I just gave Ray a copy of Hugh Ross's book. I'm giving away another one. So you'll be pre-entered to do that. But without further ado, let me bring in the video we'll be responding to. And I guess before I play the first clip, did you have any just general thoughts on the debate as a whole that you wanted to mention?
Yeah, I watched it while I was on the treadmill working out. so it was, I love to watch debates while I'm working out. Kind of weird like that. You either have to have some hard rock music or a debate, one of the two.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I didn't watch it as closely as I could have if I wasn't running. If I would have been taking, it's hard to take notes and run at the same time. But I took a lot of mental notes. And I guess the first thing I'd want to say is they both seem like great scholars. I don't know either of them. They seem like the kinds of guys I'd love to go have coffee with and have these discussions with, these iron sharpening discussions. They were both really nice and cordial with each other, even though they disagreed on some things. And I guess I would say that there was just with the content they were putting out, that they were both, the positions they were both defending. I would say at times I would agree with one and disagree with the other, and then at times I would find myself agreeing with the other and disagreeing with the guy I was previously agreeing with on different subjects. So I think they both made some correct points, and I think they were both wrong on a few things as well. But yeah, a couple great guys and brilliant guys. And as always, Cameron is an awesome host and knows probably just as much as the people that he's interviewing and letting debate on his channel. So
yeah, same thing. I mean, obviously we would more disagree with Taylor just because he's the one arguing for a kind of, we don't have the principle of alternative possibilities, which we'll get into. Yeah. But one area where I kind of major disagree with the other guy, where he just kind of mentioned, he's like, oh yeah, by the way, I do hold to a B theory, so I'm okay with kind of a simultaneous causation there.
Right.
And I was like, no, not even good. Yeah. We'd have to do a whole separate
That's
episode
exactly
on
right. That's what I was disagreeing with. I'm like, you don't need to go B theory. And I just thought, going B theory, you've got even more problems that I don't know if he's aware of or not. But I've spent a lot of time discussing different theories of time. I'm thoroughly convinced that some flavor of the A theory has to be true, even if we exist in a block universe that is typically called the, or labeled as the B theory. And I would even say that on some of these time travel thought experiments that they were giving, on the B theory still presupposes some level of dynamic time. And, we could get into the Avengers and things like that if you wanted to. But that'd probably get us off topic for today.
Yeah.
And maybe that's a conversation for another video. But
yeah, we will have to do a separate episode on like just time, because that's I'm very fascinated with that topic. But yeah, I guess, and so this is before we're going to get into the major syllogistic argument that he puts forth. So this is just kind of a preliminary clip, just to kind of kick us off and get us started. So I will go ahead and play this one.
Okay, I think it's helpful just to start with an idea of God and an idea of free will, so that we can get a sense for why some people take God and his knowledge to be incompatible with free will. So a lot of people believe that God is omniscient and take that to include that God has knowledge of what will happen in the future, including what we will do in the future. But if God is God, it's not just that he happens to be omniscient and to know what's going to happen in the future. He's also infallible. Like, he can't be wrong about what's going to happen in the future. And so that idea that God infallibly foreknows what's going to happen, including how you and I are going to act, that's what seems to call into question whether we have free will. Now, the argument focuses on one conception of free will. Some people use the term free will as a technical term just to mean this, which is the freedom or the ability to do other than what one actually does. So take some,
Hey, Stillman.
It could be a trivial action,
Yes.
It could be a really
Pause
important.
it for a second.
Okay.
I just wanted to say a quick note, and I want to get into this more later, but he's talking about the ability to do otherwise here. And that is one version of libertarian freedom, but not the only version. You've got the sourcehood version, which simply means that one is not causally determined. So if one is not causally determined, then they're free in the libertarian sense, even if for some weird reason they don't have the ability to do otherwise. But as Philip, I think, said in this conversation, if one is the source and is not causally determined, then why wouldn't they have the ability to do otherwise, or the principle of alternative possibilities? And I say, yeah, I agree, but let's just suppose, for the sake of argument, that for some weird reason, who knows what it is, a person can't do otherwise, as long as they are not causally determined, then they're still free in a libertarian sense. So anyway, I just wanted to point that out very quickly, and I do plan on talking about that more later on.
Yeah, that was perfect, because the first thing I was going to ask is the clip finish. I was going to be like, real quick, let's straighten out the definition of libertarian freedom here, and then get into the secondary part. That's cool. Perfect.
Cool.
Decision for any action that you will in fact perform. Some people think in order for you to do that thing freely, to have free will with respect to that action, it had to have been the case that you could have done otherwise, that you could have performed some other action instead, or at least not done the thing you did. So we're going to use the example of me or someone else raising their hand at a certain time. So suppose that, right now I raise my hand. Okay, so did I have free will with respect to that action? Well, on this conception of free will, in order for me to count as raising my hand freely, it had to have been the case that at that time I could have done something else instead, like not raised my hand. Okay, so now if God has, if he's infallible and has foreknowledge of what I'm going to do, then it looks like God existed 1,000 years ago, knew then exactly what I would do, whether I'd raise my hand or not. And because he's infallible, it seems like he can't be wrong. And thus this is the basic idea of the argument, that I couldn't have refrained from doing what God knew I was going to do. So that's a kind of rough presentation of it. I guess now we could talk through the more detailed formulation.
But before we get to his more detailed formulation, we're going to get into that. So what do you think about that? I guess that'll be my first question, is kind of what he just outlined there is, okay, God knows at T1 you're going to raise your hand. Mm-hmm. Do you have the ability then to not raise your hand?
Well, I believe that we do have the ability to not raise our hands.
Blasphemous.
And I think we can demonstrate this, and I think we can unpack that more as we go. But I'll just say right up front that I think we do still have the ability to do otherwise, and in this case, to refrain from raising our hands. However, let's just say I'm wrong about that. That doesn't mean we don't have the freedom, that we don't have libertarian freedom in this case. As long as we are not causally determined, then we are still free in a libertarian sense.
Sorry, I apologize there. I was getting the next clip ready. Yeah, and so my thoughts here, and this is my main thing. And maybe you have a different point as we get. My thing as I was watching through this whole debate, and as I was thinking about, for example, the previous discussion I had with Tyler Vela on my channel, I suggest people go check that one out. Because one of the things I've been trying to think through, and you can tell me what you think of this, is it seems part of the argument is what it wants to do is build God's knowledge into your ability. Right, so it starts with the premise of God has certain knowledge about certain things, and then it builds that into your ability. And if God's knowledge is part of your ability, well, then you don't have they want to say you don't have the ability to trick God. So if God already knows one thing, then it would kind of entail if you had the ability to do other things, you have the ability to fool God. And so for me, one thing I really want people to get out of this episode is try to recognize when that's happening, when someone's starting with the premise of God's knowledge and then builds that into the ability, because I think that's fallacious off the get-go. I think it might be a version of, what Braxton Hunter always talks about, which he just says knowledge isn't causal, it's a category error. So I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah, I think if I'm tracking with you, it's akin to what I like, when I'm having these discussions, I often say things like, well, that's getting the cart in front of the horse. And yeah, I'll unpack that as we go too.
Okay, cool. So so this one, I won't play the entire clip I have here, but I'll just play part of it. And I think Cameron makes some brilliant comments, so I'm hoping that's early on in the clip because I want to stop it right after that. Oop, there we go.
Okay, so the first premise of this version of the argument, and there are other versions of this same sort of argument, but the first premise of this version says God believed 1,000 years ago that I would raise my hand at T. So let's let T abbreviate sometime, maybe 5 minutes from now. So if God exists and if God has exhaustive foreknowledge, then he existed 1,000 years ago. And if in fact I'm going to raise my hand at T, then it turns out that God believed 1,000 years ago that I would raise my hand at T. So that's the first claim. The second premise, and this is where things do get a little bit more complicated, but we'll walk through it slowly. The second claim says, if one is true, that is, God believed that I'd raise my hand at T, he believed that 1,000 years ago, and I'm free not to raise my hand at T. In other words, I have free will with respect to my raising my hand, then it's in my power to do something such that were I to do it, either God would have had at least one different belief 1,000 years ago, or two, God would have had at least one false belief 1,000 years ago. And the basic idea here is imagine what it would take for me to have this power to refrain from raising my hand. It seems like what I would have to be able to do is make it such that God didn't have the correct belief about what would happen in the future, or that God just had a different belief. That's basically what this says. So my freedom to do otherwise than raise my hand at T would require one of these two things, God having a different belief or having a false belief. But then the third premise says neither of those things are in my power. So more technically, it's not in my power to do something such that were I to do it, God would have had at least one different belief 1,000 years ago, or God would have had at least one false belief 1,000 years ago. So if those things aren't in my power, then it follows, given that God believed 1,000 years ago that I'd raise my hand at T, I'm not free not to raise my hand at T. In other words, I raise my hand at T, but not freely. I don't have.
So we'll stop it there, and we'll leave this up on the screen for people as we comment. One thing that seems to me, and I know you're going to get into this and unpack this more and make some of the premises stronger, but just a real quick thought I had, and I hope this doesn't derail the points too much. It seems to me we could just add to premise 2 a third option, which is I have an ability, but one that I would never freely choose to do.
Yeah, I like that.
But anyway, so you had some points to make about this.
Yeah, it's a very interesting syllogism, and I had to read through it a couple times just to make sure. Or actually, when I was running, I took a quick break and hit the rewind button, listened to it again, and started running again. But a couple things. I guess the first thing that I'd like to do is just make the first premise even stronger. And so let's call it star one. I just say that logically prior to God's creative decree or act of creation, God knew that Sally would freely raise her hand at T, even if God never created Sally in freedom or in a freedom permitting circumstance. So even if God never created Sally, even if God never created a freedom permitting circumstance, even if God never created anything, God knows, an omniscient God knows how Sally would, if he created Sally in a freedom permitting circumstance, that Sally would either raise her hand or not. God knows this. So that's the first thing I do, is just strengthen the first premise. And then I'd add that if God freely chooses to create free Sally in this freedom permitting circumstance, again, which an omnipotent God would possess the power to do, then of course an omniscient God would know how Sally would and will freely choose 1,000 years ago, or 1,000 days ago, or 1,000 seconds ago, or 5 seconds ago. It doesn't matter. So anyway, we can unpack that a bit more. But with that said, I can affirm premise one and premise two of the syllogism. However, the Molinist can reject premise three, it seems to me, and thus reject the conclusion. Now, of course, we reject the last part of it, where he says that God would have had at least one false belief 1,000 years ago. So that's just false. Because a maximally great being, by definition, if we're talking about God and the definition of God being a maximally great being, then a maximally great being, by definition, never possesses a false belief or affirms a false belief. We can always conceive of a being who affirms one more true belief, right? So,
Yeah.
So anyway, a maximally great being never possesses a false belief and never affirms a false belief. But be that as it may, the Molinist can affirm that Sally possesses the freedom, the ability, and the power to act in such a way that God would have had a different belief than how Sally would freely choose 1,000 years ago. Even, and this is true even logically prior to God's creative decree and creative act. So it really comes down to the question: does God have the power to create a creature with the ability to choose between a range of alternative options, each of which are compatible with the creature's nature at a given moment? So it really comes down to that question. And so, he brought up omniscience, but I'd say, well, we got to bring in all the omni attributes here, and at least omnipotence as well. And I spend a lot of time on this in my book. I discuss what I call the big three of God's omni attributes and what follows from this. I even bring in God's omnibenevolence, but I don't think we need to bring in that right now. Let's just focus on omnipotence and omniscience. And I think oftentimes the exhaustive divine determinists only look at God's omnipotence. And, sometimes maybe others are just worried about his omniscience. So I say, well, we got to look at both of them, 100% of both, and factor them in all the time. So anyway, it comes down to the question: does an omnipotent God have the power to create a creature with the ability to choose between or among a range of alternative options that are each compatible with the creature's image of God nature at a given moment? So with that said, there's something else that we've got to point out. So let's suppose that I'm wrong about what I just said. Even if that were the case, if Sally did not possess the ability to do otherwise, in this case, the ability to refrain from her hand raising, for some, like I said earlier, for some weird reason, it does not follow that Sally did not raise her hand in the libertarian sense, right? Like I said before, as long as she is the source of her hand raising and nothing else causally determines Sally to raise her hand, then Sally is free in the libertarian sense. But be that as it may, I still think Sally's free and has the ability to do otherwise. I still think Sally's got that kind of freedom. And we'll talk about that more, but I just want to point out that she's still free in a libertarian sense, even if I'm wrong about that.
Yeah, that's great. So just real quick, I'm about to fast forwarding to the timestamp where Cameron says, because I think his Cameron's comment will really supplement what you just said quite well. So yeah, there we go. I got it.
Thing I wanted to say real quickly, because Philip, it looks like you're going to take aim at 3, but I have a question about number 2, and then someone else that I know has a question about the first premise. So let me get to the second one first, and I'm gonna leave the slide up. You guys can't see us talking, but that's okay. I think it's more important for you to see the premises as we're talking about them.
Yeah.
So with respect to number 2, premise 2, so you have the antecedent, if 1 is true, if the first premise is true, and I am not free to raise my hand at T, then it is in my power to do something such that were I to do it, either, and this is where my question comes in, you have a dichotomy between 1 and 2. And so in the consequent, you basically say either this is true or that is true. But it seems to me like there's a third option here, and that would just be that there is a possible world where God would have a different belief. So the reason why I bring up that third option is because it seems like you could deny, or you could say that it's impossible that God would have that God could have a different belief in the actual world than the beliefs that he actually does. So his noetic structure could be such that, or sorry, let me rephrase that. His noetic structure would be such that he couldn't have a different belief because he's infallible. So all of his beliefs sort of have to be set, and they all have to be true. So, but it doesn't follow from that there is no possible world where God has a different set of beliefs. So that's why I want to make a distinction between 1 in the consequent of 2 and what I'm calling 3, where basically it's not that God would have a different belief in the actual world, it's that God would have a different belief in some other possible world.
And I thought that was great. I thought I just wrote it right there, and then as it kind of goes on, Taylor kind of just brushes that off. Says, "Well, that aside, here's kind of the syllogism," and he just kind of reaffirms the second premise.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not saying that to dog Taylor, obviously, but I'm just pointing out that I thought it was a great point that I don't think, unfortunately, got enough attention.
Yeah.
And I think that's really important because Cameron's pointing out. Because you've already discussed Molinism and said when you made the premise stronger, you said not even just 1,000 years ago, but prior to God's creative decree. And I think we would both acknowledge as Molinists, of course, there were several different possible worlds, many possible worlds in which, of course, God's set beliefs of future events would vary from possible world to possible world. And I think, as you've pointed out, God is within his power to create a world which we have the ability to choose X, Y, or Z. All three of those abilities or possible alternatives are within our capabilities, or within our power. They're all compatible with our nature.
Mm-hmm.
But God knows which one of those we would freely do prior to his creative decree in this world, if that's the world he chooses to actualize. And so what I wrote down here, and I hope this seems as smart as it was when I wrote it down initially, but I wrote, what lies within our ability is a range of possibilities, not a range of mutually exclusive actualities. And so that would just be kind of like the law of non-contradiction. I can't simultaneously choose the chocolate and the vanilla. I can choose a mixture, but I'm talking about choosing chocolate to the exclusion of vanilla, or choosing vanilla to the exclusion of chocolate. You can't just do mutually contradictory things. And that's why it's called the principle of alternative possibilities, not the principle of alternative actualities. And so I wrote, God foreknows of which alternative possibility we will freely actualize. So I don't know if that makes any sense, or if you wanted to comment on that, or.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think Cameron was right. And one thing that I heard you say just now is you said something about a range of options, each compatible with our nature, or something like that. And You use the word compatible at some point in there, and I keyed in on that because oftentimes, the compatibilist is like, well, you can only do one thing compatible with your nature. And I say, not so fast. Why
Right.
can it not be the case that there are several things, several different alternative options, each of which are compatible with my image of God or likeness of God nature? And I think we can demonstrate that God has to have libertarian freedom in at least some things. And I think the vast majority of theologians would agree that God could have refrained from creation, right? That this world is not necessary. If that's the case, then God has the ability. He had the ability to create or not create. That's two different options, alternative options, each of which was compatible with God's divine nature. There might be some other things that God does not have the libertarian freedom to refrain from, say in a PAP sense, a principle of alternative possibility sense. Like I say, love is one of the things that God can't refrain from doing. God is love. I believe that's John 4:8. God is love. He simply is love. So he just loves. However, one could still point out that God is not causally determined by anything apart from God. So nothing is causally determining God to love. Thus, even though God doesn't have the ability to do otherwise and not love, he's still free in a libertarian sense. I've got an article on my website at freethinkingministries.com called "The Best Kind of Love." I'd point your audience to check that out. But just let me say that I think Cameron was right, and I usually distinguish between, like I said earlier, the sourcehood version of libertarian freedom and the ability to do otherwise version of libertarian freedom, also known as the PAP, which is short for the principle of alternative possibilities, right? That's a nice way of saying the ability to do otherwise. But the definition that I often defend, right? I point out, hey, we've got several definitions here, sourcehood and the PAP, but here's how I like to phrase it. I think it entails both. It's libertarian freedom refers to one's ability to choose between or among a range of alternative options, each of which is compatible with one's nature at a given moment. Now, notice that the ability to trick God or to fool God is nowhere to be found in any of those.
The next question, yeah.
Yeah, right. It has nothing to do with sourcehood, has nothing to do with PAP, has nothing to do with the ability to choose between a range of options, each of which is compatible with one's God-given nature, right? Or image of God nature. You can't find it. The ability to trick God or fool God is not part of the definition of libertarian freedom in any definition that we can choose from here. So as long as one is either the source, and by that I mean not causally determined, or has the ability to choose between a range of alternative options that are each compatible with one's nature at a given moment, if they ever have that ability, then one possesses libertarian freedom, and or what I like to call limited libertarian freedom. So one can still even be a 5-point Calvinist and think that all things about salvation or soteriology are causally determined. But you could just say, hey, like Greg Kokel does, he'll say, well, yeah, but there's other things that humans have the freedom to do that they're not causally determined to do. And so if that's the case, then I say, well, let's just call this limited libertarian freedom. That means libertarian freedom limited to things other than soteriological issues. But let's break it down. At what I think it was Philip in the debate asked the question, if one is the source and not causally determined, then why think this is not a categorical freedom? I didn't quote him perfectly there, but he said something along those lines. And after all, if there are no causal strings attached, then why can't there be a categorical freedom or an ability to do otherwise? So let's think about it. Agent P, Perry the Platypus. I don't know. You ever watch Phineas and Ferb?
Yeah.
All right. So anyway, agent P is free and able to do other than what God knows. All right. That is to say, agent P really could do otherwise, but agent P will not freely choose to do so.
Right.
Although agent P was free and able to do so and could have done so. However, if agent P were to choose otherwise, then God would have foreknown and middle known differently. So that's kind of, was that what you were going to add to that premise 2, I think? Was that basically what you were saying?
Yeah. So it was essentially that, okay, I have this ability to do Y, but I just never will freely choose to do Y.
Yeah. Right. So yeah, again, it comes down to this. An omnipotent God has the power to create a free creature, even if he never does. And an omniscient God knows how the free creatures within God's power to create would freely choose if he creates them, and even if he never does create them. So again, I'm factoring in both God's omnipotence and his omniscience together at the same time, 100% of both. So here's the bottom line, and I think the mistake that is often made is that we cannot confuse certainty with necessity. Right? It is certain that agent P will freely choose X in circumstance C at time T, but it's not necessary. Right? It's a logical error to conflate certainty with necessity. These are two different concepts. But be that as it may, even if it could be demonstrated, I'll say it again, that this is not a categorical freedom, it would still be libertarianly free in the sourcehood sense, even if there is not an ability to choose otherwise for some weird reason. Now, my interlocutor might respond, and I've gotten this many times before, hearing something like this. They might say, but it just doesn't seem right to say that in any world that God instantiates, or creates, or actualizes, that a creature is free to do other than what God knows they will do at any time T.
Man, you're just answering my questions before I even ask them. I was going to say that because I was going to say some of them are, even if we say, well, they have the ability, they just won't choose it, they'll say, but if we presuppose God knows X, I don't even want someone to have the ability to choose Y, because then that somehow presupposes the ability to fool God. But as you're pointing out, that just simply is not part of libertarian freedom.
That's right. Yeah. Sorry if I'm answering your questions too soon.
I didn't mean to derail you.
No. You derailer. No, I mean, you and I talked about this a little bit a couple days ago, and so I kind of knew what questions you were
that's true.
Yeah. So I guess my response is that this, I said it earlier, it's getting the cart in front of the horse, right? If somebody's going to say, it just doesn't seem right that in any world that God creates, that a creature is free to do other than what God knows they're going to do at any time T. Well, okay, getting the cart in front of the horse. I'll tell you, this is not what Molinism claims, nor what is required for libertarian free will. Libertarian freedom is not defined as doing other than what God knows.
Right.
Right. It's either, again, it's either one, not being causally determined by something or someone other than you. The thing you refer to as I, right? If something other than the thing you refer to as I causally determines you, then you don't have libertarian freedom. So it's either that you are not causally determined by something other than you, or 2, it's the ability to choose between or among a range of alternative options that are each compatible with one's nature at a given moment. Now, Molinism would entail the following, and I think this is true even on a categorical ability. So it goes like this. God knows Sally would freely choose X instead of non-X, even though she could have, if he were to create her in non-causal deterministic circumstance C. Okay, so that's the first one. God knows Sally would freely choose X instead of not X if he were to create her in non-causal deterministic circumstance C. Okay, that's what God knows, what Sally would do. God then creates Sally in non-causal deterministic circumstance C. So what follows? Well, now God knows Sally will freely choose X instead of not X, even though she could have, in non-causal deterministic circumstance C. So here's the takeaway from that. All that changed from the first step to the third is the word would transformed to will. But just because the word would transforms to will, the word freely does not magically disappear. And you can even say the word freely, even though she could have, does not magically disappear. The rest of the statement doesn't change. All that changes is would turns to will. So that's why I think we've still got the ability to choose otherwise. Now, we definitely have libertarian freedom in the sourcehood sense here, but I think we can still get the ability to do otherwise. And it's like you've said earlier, just because one has the ability, they could choose otherwise. They simply freely choose. They simply will freely choose not to, right? They could freely choose to do X or not X. God knows that although an agent has the ability to choose between X or not X, he knows that Sally would freely choose X. God knows that and then creates. And now all you've got is now God knows how Sally will freely choose, that Sally will freely choose X instead of not X, even though Sally really could have chosen not X, right? So this is just, if God is omnipotent and omniscient logically prior to creation, then God has this kind of knowledge, and he can create free Sally in a freedom permitting circumstance, even with an ability to do otherwise. God just simply knows how Sally will freely choose. So I'll just say this: many people make the mistake of thinking that just because one is not free or able to do other than what God knows, that they are not free to trick God, that somehow their libertarian freedom is lost. But this is a big mistake, and it leads to false conclusions. Just because one is not free to trick God, it does not logically follow that one did not freely choose in the libertarian sense. God simply middle knows and foreknows how one freely chooses. So does that make sense?
No, absolutely. There's so many great things that I've lost track of some of the things, but one of the things, just to go back a little bit, this is why I repeat it all the time, your definition of libertarian free will, because it really can't be missed. It's really important. When, sometimes I've had conversations with Calvinists, and they'll talk about our nature and what's compatible with our nature. And it seems in certain conversations I've had that what they want to affirm is that there's only one choice at any given time that's compatible with our nature. So something like the greatest of all possible desires. Like, I either wanted to smoke the cigarette and that was my greatest desire, so that was the only choice compatible with my nature, or I had other reasons for wanting to refrain, and so that was the greatest desire, and so that was the only choice compatible with my nature. But and when I say, well, there's libertarian freedom, sometimes they confuse that with complete autonomy, right? It's this ability to rise above my nature and choose something that's not compatible with my nature.
That's not what it means.
And that's not what we're just saying that at certain times we don't even have to affirm that this is the case at every decision-making point in our life, but just that it certainly seems the case that it's at least at multiple, that there just is more than one option that's compatible with your nature.
And I'll say this, that whole being able to, or that you can only choose based on your greatest desire at a certain moment. I'm not going to explain how or connect the dots right here, but I do that. In my dissertation and soon to be published book, I show that cannot always explain or describe reality, that it must be false. So stay tuned for my book. Yeah.
And then was the point about fooling God, like, and this is again why Cameron's comment was so brilliant, is because it's like, okay, God foreknows X, and so they build the whole thing on that again, and then so everything after that's going to be built on top of that, and it's like, so you have the ability to do Y, so you have the ability to do something God didn't foreknow or something, and it's like, no, but it's like, and this is why it's important when you made the distinction between would and will, right? Because it turns out, well, if you did choose Y, well, then you weren't in the possible world in which God knew you will freely choose X. It turns out actually God actualized the world in which you will freely choose Y. So I don't know if that makes sense or not, but yeah, I would just say if you
I'm
did,
tracking. Yeah.
if you no matter what you choose, that's what God would have foreknown because He's the one who actualized the world, and so the wood turned to will.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Anyway, so this next portion I'm going to play now, it moves on to the principle of alternative possibilities and morality. And he brings up the Frankfurt cases, and I know you've written about that in your book as well. So this will be a great opportunity to be able to get into some of that.
To hear. So my view is, yeah, like you said, there's this principle of alternative possibilities, which is sort of connected to the idea of free will we've been working with so far, which is free will is the freedom to do otherwise, or having that freedom to do otherwise. But you might think that we could be morally responsible for what we do. So maybe praiseworthy or blameworthy for what we do, even if we lacked alternative possibilities, even if we couldn't have done otherwise. And so some people say free will doesn't require the freedom to do otherwise. To me, that gets a little confusing. I tend to focus on moral responsibility. But I think that whatever kind of freedom or control is necessary for responsibility, that doesn't require the ability to do otherwise.
Pause it for a
And
second.
so I'm denying that.
Yes.
I think one of the major issues that people miss in this conversation is not just moral responsibility, but rational responsibility. And I always try to say, I start with rational responsibility, and then I like to show how moral responsibility is related to rational responsibility. But it's, irrational beings aren't held morally accountable or morally responsible, right? We even hear this in theological circles. Well, this young man never reached the age of accountability. Well, what does that mean? The age in which he can start thinking rationally, right? So, so yeah, we hear this all the time when I'm having conversations with compatibilists and semi-compatibilists. They talk about moral responsibility, and I always stop them and say, let's start with rational responsibility first, and then we'll have some discussions on moral responsibility. So I'll get into that later. I just wanted to make that quick point.
Yeah, absolutely.
This principle of alternative possibilities, which says that in order to be morally responsible for some action, you had to have been able to do otherwise. So the main reason that people like me doubt PAP, the principle of alternative possibilities, has to do with what's called Frankfurt-style cases. And these are just cases where it looks like someone can't do otherwise, and yet intuitively they're morally responsible for what they do. So the classic version of the case is something like this. Suppose that I'm deliberating about which candidate to vote for, candidate A or candidate B, and I'm not going to make up my mind until I'm in the voting booth. But suppose that unbeknownst to me, this neuroscientist who really wants me to vote for candidate A has secretly, covertly, in my sleep, implanted this device in my brain that will give this neuroscientist the capability to override my decision-making if need be and force me to vote for candidate A. And also it lets him monitor what I'm deliberating about. He's going to be able to tell if I'm going to decide to vote for candidate B. So I'm in the voting booth and I'm deliberating about which candidate to vote for. And as it happens, for my own reasons, I decide to vote for candidate A, and I do vote for candidate A. And so the neuroscientist who's been watching this whole time, monitoring my deliberations, never intervenes, just monitors. And so a lot of people think, well, if it turns out that had I shown any sign that I was going to vote for candidate A, I would have been forced by the neuroscientist sorry, did I say B, right? In any case, if I showed any sign that I was going to vote for candidate B, the neuroscientist would have stepped in and forced me to decide to vote for candidate A. Well, then it looks like I can't do anything but decide to vote for candidate A. And yet, because the neuroscientist never intervened, they're a merely counterfactual intervener, as some people say, it looks like I'm fully morally responsible for that decision, deciding to vote for candidate A. And so that looks like a straightforward counterexample to PAP, because it's a case where it looks like I am morally responsible for my decision, and yet I couldn't have done otherwise than make that decision.
So why does
so something that just popped up to me, and I know you have a point about this, and so I won't say it because I want to give it to you. But something that I've watched that clip like 3 times now, and what just popped in my brain is he said one of the abilities that the neuroscientist has is monitoring your brain to know if you decide to vote for candidate B. Well, what does that presuppose, Tim?
That the mad scientist has the ability to interfere or not.
Yeah, the point you already brought up to me before, the Frankfurt case by itself presupposes the principle of alternative possibilities.
Oh, well, that's right, and it presupposes it for another reason.
What's that?
I'll explain here.
Okay.
So, yeah, so I love thinking about these Frankfurt experiments, and the Frankfurtian, I'll say the person who promotes the Frankfurt experiments, they assert that these experiments prove that the libertarian freedom to do otherwise is not needed for moral responsibility here. Now, I think some of these cases do show that that there's sometimes when a person couldn't do otherwise and they're still held morally accountable or responsible. I'll say that. But although it seems intuitive that one must possess the ability to behave otherwise in order to be held morally responsible for his or her actions, the Frankfurtian does counter this intuition by offering some pretty clever thought experiments. This one is probably a mad scientist from Russia because they like to supposedly interfere with American elections. I don't know if you've heard anything. So with that in mind, consider the upcoming American election and a Russian mad scientist who's trying to interfere. So imagine a man whose brain has been secretly implanted with these electrodes by the Russian mad scientist. Now, the scientist, being a Joe Biden supporter, decides that he will activate the electrodes to make the man vote for Biden if the man goes into the polling booth to vote for Trump. On the other hand, if the man chooses to vote for Biden, then the scientist will not activate the electrodes. It's hands off at that point. So suppose then the man goes into the polling booth and presses the button to vote for Biden, the blue button to vote for Biden. In such a case, it seems that the man freely votes for Biden. Yet it was not within his power to do anything different, right? He had to vote for Biden. But in this case, it's clear that he freely chose to do so, and thus he's responsible, even though he doesn't have a PAP, a principle of alternative possibilities, or so it seems. But you see, these kinds of thought experiments demonstrate that although the voter had no ability to vote for anyone other than Biden, he was still responsible for his bad decision to vote for Biden. Why? Freudian slip, I suppose. Why? Because it was his choice. It was up to him, even though he could not do it. He could not do, act, behave, or vote otherwise. So Frankfurt experiments seem successful in demonstrating that an ability to do otherwise is not always essential for moral responsibility. So at this point, many determinists, they drop their microphones at the feet of us libertarian freedom fighters and they say, game over, what you going to do? And I say, well, not so fast. There's two big problems facing the Frankfurtian, or so it seems to me. First of all, what if we run this thought experiment the other way? Suppose the voter, after deliberating for whom to vote, decides to press the red button, casting a vote for Trump. The mad scientist has access to the voter's brain, and the moment before the voter pushes the red button to vote for Trump, the mad scientist from Russia sees what's about to happen and activates the electrodes in the voter's brain to make the man's finger hit the blue button to vote Democrat. The man, although intending to vote for Trump, casts a vote for the Democrat, and God forbid, Biden wins the election by one single vote, those pesky Russians. Now, in this scenario, in the second scenario, who is really responsible for the vote for the Democratic candidate? For Biden. it surely was not the voter, because he had
Right.
deliberated and intended and tried to vote for Trump. The Russian mad scientist here is the one who's responsible for the vote for the Democrat. So in this case, when you run the Frankfurt thought experiment backwards, Frankfurt fails in the sense that it will backfire on anyone appealing to use it to bolster a deterministic worldview. In this case, it's clear that the voter was not responsible for the act of voting. Now, let's get to the second problem, and I think the bigger problem. Even in the original scenario where the voter could not vote other than for Biden and Biden alone, it does not follow that the voter did not possess libertarian free will, namely the libertarian freedom to think or think otherwise, right? The libertarian freedom to deliberate. This is the case because it seems that this famous Frankfurt experiment still assumes the libertarian ability to be a free thinker.
Right.
Talking about rational responsibility here. It was only after the voter deliberated and thought freely regarding for whom he should cast his vote that the mad scientist decides whether to step in and rig the election or not. So the PAP, the principle of alternative possibilities, has not been debunked. Rather, it's been assumed in this thought experiment. But we can even go further now. Since we're discussing mad scientists, let's invite the mad scientist back into the lab to reach a stronger conclusion. So now, the only way the Frankfurt or the Frankfurtian here can get past this and say, okay, well, no, you don't have the libertarian freedom to think, is now to say that even your thoughts, all of your thoughts and your beliefs about your thoughts and your thoughts about your beliefs and your deliberations and your judgments and everything is caused and determined by something or someone else, or it just could not be otherwise ever. Okay, so let's invite the mad scientist back to the lab. Now suppose the mad scientist exhaustively controls and causally determines all of the voter's thoughts and beliefs all the time. And this includes exactly what the voter thinks of and about, and exactly how the voter thinks of and about it. Let me say that again. This doesn't just include what the voter thinks of or what the voter thinks of and about, but exactly how the voter thinks of and about it. So all of the voter's thoughts about his beliefs and all of his beliefs about his thoughts are caused and determined by the mad scientist. And this also includes the next words that will come out of the voter's mouth, not to mention his voting thoughts or voting actions that follow. So here's a question. How can the voter, not the mad scientist, rationally affirm the current thoughts and or beliefs in his head as good, bad, better, the best, true, or probably true without begging the question? That's impossible. He can't do such a thing. So it's clear that although both scenarios do not allow for the voter to vote otherwise, the voter is not responsible when the mad scientist overrides his actions that would follow from his free thinking, or when the mad scientist takes total control of all the man's thinking. So you see, this particular version of the mad scientist thought experiment demonstrates the importance of libertarian freedom. If one is really to be held responsible, then their thoughts and any action that follows from a certain thought must not be causally determined via external sources like physics or God, sorcerers, or mad scientists from Russia. The libertarian ability to be a free thinker is essential for not only moral responsibility, but for rational responsibility. And I argue that the rational responsibility is even more important, because moral responsibility is built upon the foundation of rational responsibility. So what do you think?
No, I absolutely agree. And it was funny, one of the things, we had discussed before, talking about how it presupposed principle of alternative possibilities, because it was important in the beginning how you gave the two alternatives. In this case, the mad scientist doesn't intervene and the guy chooses it. He's morally responsible. And in the second case, the mad scientist does intervene, and so he's the one who's morally responsible, not the voter. The reason that's important is because those two different paths to arrive at the same conclusion are very different paths. You can't just equate them and say, well, essentially because they complement each other and exclude the principle of alternative possibilities, therefore it's kind of irrelevant how the person gets to the conclusion. No, it's very relevant how the person gets to the conclusion, because either he gets to it in a way where he's morally responsible, or he gets to it in a way where he's not morally responsible.
Well, hey, you're exactly right that it's vital about how we reach our conclusions, and it's even vital about how we reach true beliefs. Do we reach our true beliefs by sheer luck, or are we the kinds of beings that have been created to reach our conclusions rationally, and to possess knowledge? Either justified true belief or warranted justified true belief. I mean, I like to say it this way. Imagine you're in a math class, and you got 3 students in this math class, and the teacher gives a quiz, and it's a story problem, and it's also a multiple choice. They've got 4 answers from which to choose, but they've got to do some work to reach the conclusion, or so you think. Well, the first student doesn't understand the question at all, and is like me in high school, didn't understand the story problem. So he looks on his neighbors, or no, this guy doesn't do that. He just guesses. He's like, I don't know, it's either A, B, C, or D, and C. Circle C. Well, guess what? He happens to be right, but does he possess knowledge? Of course not. He has a true belief that's based on luck. The second student doesn't understand the question either, but he cheats off his neighbor to his right, and hoping that she got it right, because she's usually pretty smart. So he's like, okay, what is she? And she circled C, and so he does the same thing. But does he possess knowledge? No, there's no justification there. He hasn't showed his work. He cheated. That doesn't count as knowledge. But then the girl, the third person, she understands the story problem just fine. And not only did she circle C, but she showed all the work in the margin of the paper, showing why she understood that the correct answer was C. You see, this is a justification here. She could connect the dots, so to speak, and show exactly why the correct answer was C. This is a justification. Socrates called this the tether to reality. You possess knowledge when you have a rational justification or a rational tether to a belief claim. Now, if naturalistic determinism is true, our beliefs are not aimed at truth, right? Alvin Plantinga has shown this in his evolutionary argument against naturalism. My free thinking argument, I think, is I feel weird saying this, but stronger in a sense than Plantinga's argument, because I show that it's not aimed at anything. On Plantinga's argument, your beliefs are aimed at survival, which is a problem because they're not aimed at truth. But one could say, but true beliefs will probably help you survive better, so you evolved to have more. Well, I just say, look, if physics and chemistry is running the show, physics and chemistry isn't aimed at anything. It just physics and pops and does its thing. And if that's what's causing your beliefs, then how you reach your beliefs, they're not justified. There's no tether there. I think it's even just as bad if one thinks that God causally determines all of your thoughts and beliefs all the time. Because although God can create a being who can reach true conclusions, if God is running the entire show and causally determining everything, what I call exhaustive divine determinism, then that means that your beliefs aren't aimed at truth either. Rather, they're aimed at the center, the dead center of the will of God. And obviously, the majority of humanity possesses false theological beliefs. Most Christians disagree on things, and even Calvinists disagree on certain things. And in fact, not long ago, Guillaume Bignon, one Calvinist, said about Greg Koukl, another Calvinist, that God causally determined Greg Koukl to affirm a false belief. Well, wow. I mean, so our beliefs aren't reliable if that's the case, because we've got a God who causes every human to hold at least one false theological belief, and the majority of humanity to hold horrible theological beliefs. And so our conclusions, at least on theology and metaphysics, aren't reliable at all there either. So anyway, that's just all on top of what you said, that it's important about how we reach our beliefs. I believe that God created us with an ability to, I think we've got these properly basic beliefs, and then we can build on top of these properly basic beliefs. And that requires freedom to judge and weigh alternative options, to judge something as good, bad, better, the best, true or false, or probably true, probably false, whatever. If we don't have that ability, and let's say there's only one thing compatible with my nature, that I can only judge a certain proposition as bad when it's actually true, then my belief forming faculties aren't reliable. They're caused and determined by something else. So anyway, I just went off on a little tangent there. Thought I'd throw that in.
No, you're fine. That's absolutely right. And it's funny because as I think about this more, and as I'm thinking about what you're saying, and I'm not trying to hammer Taylor too hard for this, because as you've brought up, there are more sophisticated versions of the Frankfurt-style cases. But one thing is when he says, okay, here's this neuroscientist, and he comes in and he looks at a given person, and he wants the person to, well, the neuroscientist, it's presupposing that the guy has the ability to do otherwise. He has the ability to choose B. Otherwise, the neuroscientist isn't even necessary.
Yeah, that's right.
Right.
Yeah.
And also when he's saying the neuroscientist is monitoring his faculties just in case he chooses B, well, what's he doing? He's monitoring faculties that have the ability to change their mind for different reasons and vote for candidate B.
Yeah.
And so the only way, to me, so I was gonna say there's only two ways you can get out of that. One would be bad, and one would be, I think, good for us anyway. The one is to say that, well, God is essentially the neuroscientist who does exclude the principle of alternative possibilities by making sure at any given moment he would intervene. But then so many people aren't morally responsible. There's determinism in that. Or you could say, well, that God just actualizes the world in which he doesn't have to intervene. People just would freely choose the certain things. Well, then you're a Molinist.
Right.
So yeah,
even in a Molinist world, which I think is the case. It's not that God could never step in and causally determine something. It's just that right? He just probably doesn't have to most of the time, or at least some of the time. So
well, that's the thing. Like when Calvinists will bring up, well, God hardened Pharaoh's heart, or Satan entered Judas. It's like, okay, well, the first thing, step back for a minute and just realize these are exceptions to the rule. Right, that's not the case with every single figure in the Bible, that God's constantly either hardening their hearts or directing them towards this or causing this. So it does seem to be
I'd probably push back on that application in that passage. I think.
I was going to say, let's say even if I grant, because me and Braxton Hunter were talking about this. Let's say I grant that, say, Pharaoh wasn't libertarianly free in the sense that God didn't harden his heart such that he would make a decision, right?
Okay. And so grant that for the sake of argument.
Yes, I wouldn't. But let's say for the sake of argument, I grant that Pharaoh is not libertarianly free in that sense. It still doesn't follow that. I still think you would have to at least assume, though, prior to God hardening Pharaoh's heart, Pharaoh did have a principle of alternative possibilities such that he's morally responsible, so that he chose to conduct himself in a way that, obviously if he was good all the time and treated the Israelites well and was willing to let them go, God's not just only going to harden his heart. We believe that Pharaoh did conduct himself in a way prior to that he was kind of the villain. He was making bad decisions. He was mistreating them. He was, an enemy of Moses in that sense. And so, he essentially set himself up to have his heart hardened at that point. So I don't know, but so I'm glad we got into that point. So here we go. We're going to fast forward a little bit. And okay, this is why I wanted to play the clip, because coming off of that. So we can kind of think of that almost in a Calvinistic worldview, and you've offered the responses, and I think that's good. But now he's going to use the same line of argumentation to shift and say, well, even just on a strict determinist model, we can still have moral responsibility. So I'm going to play that clip here. Sorry.
The soundness of the argument that we started with, and just say, yeah, if free will requires the freedom to do otherwise, then God's foreknowledge precludes free will. But I want to say what we care about, namely being morally responsible for what we do, that doesn't depend on free will in that sense. the kind of control required for moral responsibility doesn't require being able to do otherwise. And so, like I said, the Frankfurt cases are part of the motivation for that. If you have the same response to the case as I do, where it seems like all that matters for your moral responsibility is something about the actual sequence that led to you're making the decision, you're doing the action, it has nothing to do with alternative possibilities, well, then you should think of control and moral responsibility as being all about the actual sequence. So yeah, that's my semi-compatibilist view, I guess.
Okay, so I was wrong about I had the wrong clip there. My apologies there. But I do think you kind of already preeminently answered that point, because he's saying, well, we care about the sequence to get there. But it seems if we never have the principle of alternative possibilities, you point out, if the neuroscientist is controlling everything all the way down to the bottom, then there just isn't rational reasoning there, and thus there's no moral responsibility. So did you have anything you wanted to add before I skip to the next clip?
I just will agree. If there's no such thing as libertarian freedom, then if the mad scientist is causally determining the whole show, then that's a big problem. And also, if God causally determines the entire show, this is why I argue against exhaustive determinism, either exhaustive determinism from a naturalistic sense or exhaustive divine determinism. Both views will fail to explain reality, at least all of reality. Sure, you can point to some instances. I mean, no one denies that a falling domino has the ability to do otherwise, right? That is causally determined. My receding hairline was causally determined. I didn't have a choice about that. But some of my fellow libertarians think that. Well, I'll just say this: I'm most, like I said it earlier, I'm most concerned with the principle of alternative possibilities when it comes to thinking. And if we don't have that, then we're not rationally responsible. And I could then build an argument on top of that if we're not rationally responsible, because if we don't have the libertarian freedom to think, then we're not rationally responsible, and then we would not be morally responsible if we never have the ability to freely think. So, yeah, I don't know. I write a lot about this in my book that's coming out soon. I have even atheists I get, some well-known philosophers of mind who are atheists who are going to agree with me. I use them to support my views. I even go then to Calvinists who agree with me. And I got some great block quotes there, and then have other Christian theists too, who are going to support this. So it's interesting to find people in camps of those who normally affirm exhaustive determinism, who are like, whoa, wait a second here. If we're going to say there's no libertarian freedom ever, then we're going to be hurting, because we can't even reach rational conclusions or affirm or rationally affirm any proposition. So yeah, I don't know. You want to say anything more about that?
No, I think that's great. JMD Apologetics 101, John Dunphy, because he's chimed in with his trollish self and said, can reason lead to hair?
I wish it could.
It's okay. I'm thinning up here a little bit, so I'm catching up to you. I can still kind of make something up.
Our friend Joshua Rasmussen, he said he's got a book called How Reason Can Lead to God. And I always say, well, okay, if reason can lead to God, then reason can lead to heaven. And I always say, in heaven, I'm going to have a full head of like Thor-style hair. It's going to be long blonde hair. When you see me up there, just look for, you'll think I'm Thor at first, but then you're like, oh, like that. So maybe reason can lead to hair in that sense.
That's a good point. All right. So we have one more clip here. We had two more, but I'm going to skip one because at this point we've already answered it. So that this is one of my favorite points, but let's bring it in here.
I haven't really talked too much about causal determinism, but another part of my view is that causal determinism, and Philip would agree with this, causal determinism would preclude the freedom to do otherwise, free will in that sense. And it turns out we don't know whether causal determinism is true or not, right? The cosmologists and physicists have different interpretations of quantum mechanics, and it could turn out, I think it's sort of an epistemic possibility that we find out that determinism is true. And whereas if you're a libertarian about free will, someone who thinks that free will requires the falsity of determinism, you'd be in bad shape if we discovered that determinism is true. So in that sense, my view of ourselves as responsible agents is resilient to the discoveries of at least some of the sciences.
Yeah, so, okay. So, one thing, it's epistemically possible we discover that determinism is true, but because of the arguments he's provided from the Frankfurt-style cases, we could still be held morally responsible. So 2 separate points, but I'll ask you about the first one first. Well, actually, maybe do them in reverse order just because it'll be kind of piggybacking on what we've already discussed. If causal determinism is true, Tim, can we possibly be held morally responsible?
Not if exhaustive causal determinism is true. Again, as we've already discussed, that Frankfurt case presupposes the libertarian freedom to think. And so if a mad scientist, a sorcerer, physics and chemistry, or God is causally determining everything a person thinks about and how they think of and about it, what they think of and about and exactly how they think of and about it, their judgments, their weighing, their evaluations are all causally determined by the mad scientist or God or whatever. I fail to see how any responsibility follows from that, because God is responsible for everything.
Yeah.
So, like I said, if he says that he's a semi-compatibilist. I've written on some of the stuff on semi-compatibilism and the difference between regulative and guidance control. And it's fun. You can come up with some odd thought experiments that show that sometimes when it comes to actual physical actions, as long as you have guidance control, you're still morally responsible. But like I said, all you got to do is reverse it. And now you see, oh yeah, you actually need regulative control in that case. And I have an article on my website about this, and it's a fun thought experiment. I could share it if you want, but it has to do with Yoda and K2SO, the droid from the Star Wars movie Rogue One that came out a few years ago. And I show that, man, you got to at least have the libertarian freedom and the ability to think otherwise in order to be held responsible. So anyway, I don't know if you want me to talk about semi-compatibilism right now, or if you want me to just focus on this point he made right now about if it's shown that, well, he says it's epistemically possible for causal determinism to be true. Do you want me to talk about that?
Yes, but I'd like to rephrase it the way he said it, because I think it is an important kind of difference. So he said it's as epistemically possible we discover that determinism is true.
Right. Well, I guess my response would be there's a lot of things that are epistemically possible, but it's ontologically impossible, or I'll say metaphysically impossible, for anyone to discover that exhaustive causal determinism is true. That exhaustive determinism is true for reasons that we've already talked about. It's metaphysically impossible unless one wants to say that unless one is going to affirm, he can't argue for it. He could affirm that he's not rational or that he doesn't possess knowledge based on the process of rationality. But if one affirms that, then nobody needs to listen to anything else they say.
Right, including
I can't argue for
determinism was true.
What's
So
that?
did you rationally look at the evidence for determinism and conclude, oh, that's true?
Right. If so to, I guess the free thinking argument shows that it's impossible to rationally argue against libertarian freedom, the libertarian ability to think, and to gain knowledge via the process of rationality. So, yeah, sure, we can find some things that seem to be causally determined, but my argument and several of my arguments found in my upcoming book logically and deductively demonstrate that humans must possess the libertarian freedom to think. In fact, I point out that it's, like I said, it's logically self-defeating to argue against the proposition that humans possess libertarian freedom. So I guess with that said, I just say stay tuned for my book, Human Freedom, Divine Knowledge, and Mere Molinism. But if people want to find out more about the free thinking argument, got a lot on that on my website and on my YouTube channel. But the best source will be my book coming out. I'll really unpack it and go into depth and detail with it there.
Yeah,
Yeah, go ahead.
The thought experiment you were just bringing up that you asked about compatibilism or incompatibilism. Did you want to share that before we wrap things up?
Oh, with Yoda and
Yeah.
the droid? Yeah, let me see if I have this. Let me see if I can find it here. Okay, here's my notes on that. So, yeah, I'll just read some of this to you. Semi-compatibilists agree with the libertarian freedom fighters that control is necessary to ground responsibility, even if one does not have the control to actually act or behave otherwise. Those affirming this view claim that there are two kinds of control that we must distinguish: regulative control, that's regulative control, and guidance control. Now, regulative control requires the ability to physically act otherwise, but guidance control does not. Guidance control is enough, they claim, to ground human responsibility, even if all physical events are causally determined by God, nature, or mad scientists. Now, I can see that this guidance control could sometimes allow for responsibility, but definitely not all the time, and probably not most of the time. And if it does, we are not talking about exhaustive divine determinism, that God causally determines all things all the time, but something else. So with that, here's the Star Wars thought experiment. Consider the droid K2SO in the Rogue One Star Wars flick in these different scenarios. So here's scenario 1. Okay, 1. K2SO was built and programmed by Arrakid Industries to have a nature that always chooses or acts in accordance with the goals of the Empire. K2 is not responsible for being built by Arrakid Industries, and the droid is not responsible for its programmed Empire nature. K2 is even programmed to like his programming. K2 is not responsible for how he was programmed. Okay. Next step, 2. K2SO was stolen against the droid's will and reprogrammed with a new nature that will now always choose or act in accordance with the goals of the rebellion, which are antithetical to the goals of the Empire. K2 is even programmed by Cassian Andor to like his new programming. K2 is not responsible for how he was reprogrammed. All of K2's thoughts and actions are determined by the nature of his programming, none of which was up to the droid. K2 is not responsible for his programming or how the programming determines him to think or act. Next step, 3. But suppose that somehow K2 was able to transcend his programmed nature and began to freely think and freely choose to act on his own. If this is the case, then K2 possesses libertarian free will, at least as far as thinking goes. But wait, let's also suppose that Yoda senses a disturbance in the Force and knows that K2 has somehow transcended his programming. Well, Yoda now uses the Force to manipulate all of the physical actions of K2 to guarantee that these actions only approximate to the rebellion's goals. K2 can think otherwise, but cannot act otherwise. Next step, 4. Now suppose that although K2 has somehow transcended his programmed nature and now possesses the libertarian freedom to think freely, he also freely chooses to act in the exact same manner that Yoda just so happens to be forcing K2 to act. This is an example of what semi-compatibilists call guidance control. The agent makes free thinking decisions that just so happen to coincide with the only way physical actions could be. However, it is vital to notice that this is not exhaustive determinism, as K2's thoughts were not causally determined. In this sense, I concede that K2 should be held responsible and is worthy of praise for his good actions. This is the case because the droid has libertarian freedom to think and freely chose to act in the only manner that he physically could act, although K2 did not know he could not do otherwise. K2's actions were genuinely up to him, and he wanted to act in the exact same manner as he did act. Although K2 had no ability to act or move otherwise, Yoda made sure of that much. But the question is raised, did K2 have the ability to at least think or want otherwise? That's the big question, and the one that the free thinking argument is focused upon. Consider the next scenario. This is step 5. Suppose once again that K2 somehow transcends his new program nature that causally determines the droid to always make choices or to act in accordance with the goals of the rebellion. However, this time, K2 uses his libertarian freedom and freely chooses to go back to acting in accordance with the droid's original programmed Empire nature. Libertarian K2 now freely chooses to act in accordance with the Empire's evil goals. All is not lost, however, because Yoda is still there, using the Force to manipulate K2's actions. Even the words that come out of the droid's mouth are causally determined by Yoda, and everything the droid physically does is in accordance with the goals of the rebellion as the droid saves the day. K2SO cannot do otherwise, right? He can't act otherwise, but he was freely thinking, freely wanting, and freely trying to do otherwise. In this scenario, who is responsible for all the good that K2SO is doing for the rebellion? Surely K2 is not to be praised because Yoda is responsible. Yoda should be praised in this scenario. So the only time the droid was really responsible for his actions was when he somehow transcended his programmed nature and freely chose to act in accordance with the way Yoda was forcing him to act anyway. He possessed free thinking in a libertarian sense in this instance and had so-called guidance control. All other examples demonstrate that either whoever programmed K2 last was responsible for his actions, or Yoda was responsible for the droid's actions. In the last scenario offered in 5, the droid still possessed the libertarian freedom to think otherwise, but not to act otherwise. And it's vital to distinguish between the two. However, in this scenario, exhaustive determinism is false because one is free in the libertarian sense to think otherwise. And this is why I contend that, like Peter Van Inwagen's consequence argument and different versions of it demonstrate that compatibilism and even semi-compatibilism do not allow for free will or responsibility if all is exhaustively determined. It's nothing but word games if one asserts otherwise. So I've written a couple articles on that on my website too, and touch on that some more in my book, but that should be good enough for now, I think.
Yeah, and if there's any articles you'd like me to link in the description, just send them over. You can just message them to me, and I'll just add them to the description of the video. So yeah, that was brilliant. I'm actually gonna have to go back and watch it a couple of times because some of the things I think were a little complicated, went over my head. Admittedly. But no,
you've got a droid who somehow transcends his programming, and then Yoda senses it in the Force and uses the Force to manipulate him. So it is kind of complicated, but I encourage you and your audience to go back and listen to it a few times.
Yeah, and I unfortunately am not familiar with Star Wars. Some people consider that the unforgivable sin, but nonetheless. So the YouTube channel, everyone, Free Thinking Ministries, obviously freethinkingministries.com. It's .com, right? Not .org.
Yeah, I think both will get you there, but definitely .com.
Okay, awesome. And then obviously the Twitter, TS Express, also at Free Thinking Ministries. Are there any other places people can find you?
Just on Facebook, we've got the Free Thinking Podcast group that you have to request to join. Then there's the Free Thinking Ministries Facebook page that anybody can join. But yeah, the best place is either freethinkingministries.com or highly recommend subscribing to the Free Thinking Ministries YouTube channel. That would help us out a lot.
Yeah. You're a few subscribers ahead of me. I'm trying to catch up now. I'm just kidding. Very, very happy that to see everyone doing well. It's really tremendous, how YouTube has become such a great way for apologists to get information out there. A few, it started just for cat videos, then atheists kind of made their online presence. But now to see guys like you capturing Christianity, What Do You Mean, John McCrae, it really is tremendous, because it used to be you had to get a PhD and publish a book to really get this complex information out there. And now people can just start a YouTube channel and get all the books from Amazon written by the brilliant people. And I can't wait to read your book, do an episode on it. So until next time, thank you so much for being here, brother. Dr. Tim Stratton, everyone. And we'll definitely get you back on to talk about the book.
Yeah, thanks, man. Had a great time.
Absolutely. And for people who go subscribe to subscribestar.com/TUA, you get to see the web extender we're about to do.